Well, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for joining us once again. This is Global Arena on your favorite channel, Global Arena TV, with me, Umar Isa Dandago. And we are having a very interesting conversation with Professor Fahed Al-Sumait, Professor of Political Communication at American University of Kuwait, there in the oil-rich nation of Kuwait in the Gulf region of the Middle East. Thank you very much, Professor, for coming back on the show.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Well, I hope you enjoyed the previous episode in which you talked mostly about your personal life and your academic life and other things related to that.
Yes, thank you.
Yeah. Well, this episode is going to be very, very serious because there are so many hot and heated political topics that we're going to be looking at, which are very much related and connected to the region of Middle East. First of all, I'm very much captivated by one of your researches entitled The Arab Democratization. But before I ask you about it, take us through briefly some of the researches that you conducted and which one is your favorite?
It's kind of like being a parent and asked to choose your favorite child. It's not easy to say which is your favorite research. I think the first journal article that I published is still one that I very much would like to continue working on, but haven't found the time, which is about democratization and its rhetorical relationship with terrorism, in which I looked at myself and my co-authors, Colin Lingle and David Domke. We looked at how at that time, this was not too long after the invasion of Iraq, democracy was used as a rhetorical device both to explain the problem of terrorism and also as the cure. And we call it terrorism cause and cure, the rhetorical regime of democracy, with kind of a nod to Foucault's work on regimes of truth. And the basic idea is that when you looked at how the George Bush administration, the UK under Tony Blair, etc., the whole war on terror, talked about the existence of terrorism as being heavily influenced by, one, a lack of democracy in many countries, Arab countries and others, and two, as the presence of democracy in Western quote-unquote countries as being a point of derision or something that terrorists hated, was the term. They hate us for our democracy was often a phrase that was used. And yet at the same time,
George W. Bush said, "You're either with us or you're against us."
Yes, famously, he drew a line in the sand, so to speak. But simultaneously is talking about democracy or the absence of democracy, so the presence and the absence of democracy as both somehow responsible for terrorism and the terrors that come with it. They also talked about democracy as the cure for terrorism. That is, if you were to bring democracy to these countries that don't have it, then inevitably this will reduce terrorism because people will find political venues to express their discontent rather than using terror. And so the idea that that democracy was both a cause and a cure for terrorism, and the ways in which, I'm not sure how much they actually believe that. I mean, maybe they did, but certainly they used it as a rhetorical tool to try and put pressure and to come up with ideas like you're either with or against us. You're either for democracy or you're for terrorism, was kind of the ways in which they constructed it. And I continued looking at the question of democracy specifically as it relates to an Arab context with my dissertation. And I was very interested in sort of the contestation over the idea, the very notion of democracy from a Western, quote unquote, Western point of view in the UK and the US versus how it was viewed in a place like Kuwait, where I did my field work amongst various kinds of political actors. And, you know, I looked back over decades of political speeches, media coverage, both in print and broadcast, and other things in the US and the UK. to look at how they, primarily in the US, I believe for my dissertation, primarily how they kind of went from this idea of democracy as kind of a foreign policy selling point to all of a sudden making it the primary foreign policy selling point, but without really changing the nature of what they meant by democracy, because democracy itself.
I would like to cut you off. I'm sorry, briefly.
No problem.
Are you saying that the United States of America has made the propagation of democracy to other countries as its #1 priority of its foreign policy? Is that the case?
I'm saying that that was the case. That was the case at the time I was doing my dissertation research. I was studying between 2006 to 2011, up until the events of the late 2010, 2011 of the Arab Spring, as it's often called, the Arab Uprising is the term I prefer to use.
During Arab Spring and Arab Uprising, what's the difference?
Yeah, well, the Arab Spring sort of implies a seasonal aspect to it. It's trying to harken back on other kinds of springs and renaissance that have happened, and it very much sort of conjures this notion of a renewal or a rebirth. But really, I think a more accurate description of what was happening during that period of time was that there were a series of uprisings in countries where they did want more political say, they did want less corruption, they did want their voices to be heard better. But I think where an uprising varies from, say, a renaissance or a spring, is an uprising is a grassroots mobilization of people in protest against, what they see as injustice. But there's no codified political unit. There's no program for what comes next. So while it was, I think, a very honest and true reflection of frustrations across the region, it wasn't something that had a clear political roadmap of what to do. And I think this is why, after you see the downfall of regimes in places like Egypt or Libya or Yemen or whatever, that the political vacuum that's created by the lack of a political agenda, once the rulers have been removed, quickly gets filled by those who are already in privileged positions to capitalize on that power. And those are people who are traditionally close to the regime or that already have some level of power. And so it doesn't necessarily, an uprising doesn't necessarily by nature lead to the establishment of a functional, democracy and everything that entails.
So can we say that it was a mistake for the Arabs of those countries to rise up against their leaders, say Hosni Mubarak of Egypt, Gaddafi of Libya, Ben Ali of Tunisia? Was it a mistake carried out by the Arabs at that time, for example?
I think to say it's a mistake implies that there's a right and a wrong. I mean, it was I think a true and honest expression of political frustration, of economic frustration, of social frustration, of many other kinds of things that people legitimately felt. So I wouldn't say mistake is a word that I would use personally to describe it, but I would say where things could have gone better would be if they were less spontaneous and they were more, let's say they had a stronger political agenda. But by the nature of how politics operate in the countries we've been mentioning, especially back then, the ruling powers intentionally made sure that there was a void of potential opposition. Restrictions on, for example, the press, restrictions on civil society, restrictions on political opposition. And so when you don't have, any kind of political balance, you've got a lopsided system. When that system collapses, you don't have something that can be plugged in to try and fill it. So I don't think it was a mistake so much. It was an unfortunate consequence of the uprisings that it was hard to find something to replace the regimes. Tunisia, for example, worked very hard to try and come up with a better legislative process, a better division of power, etc. And we're making some good headway for a while, but without solidifying the institutions.
Yeah. Tunisia is said to be the only success story of the Arab Spring or Arab uprising, even though they are also having their own fair share of issues, with Kais Saied said to be, well, a dictator, dictatorial like some type of leader. There, dissolving parliament I think a year ago or so.
But
so
yeah,
they too.
He certainly consolidated his power, as many do. I think, what's important to keep in mind is that, democracy is not something that can happen overnight. It didn't happen in Western Europe or the United States overnight, right? I mean, democracy is something that you have to think of as a long durée. It's something that over a long period of time, as laws become codified, as institutions are built, as separations of powers start to become more solidified, as civil society organizations grow in power, as things like the press continue to hold power to account. And these are not things that will happen neither overnight nor in a decade, probably not in a generation. Certainly, if you think about, the period of time between, say, the Magna Carta and the establishment of the kind of democracy as we see it now in the United Kingdom, that took a couple hundred years, I believe. So, I don't think that we can write off the events of the Arab Spring as somehow not being a quote unquote success or thinking of them only as a mistake. They are a legitimate expression of frustration, and unless those frustrations are dealt with, there's going to continue to be issues, no matter how strong the repression might be in the wake of these kind of uprisings. Whether that happens soon or whether that happens later, that's the real question.
But personally, Professor Fahed Al-Sumait, if I were to ask you, would you personally blame the West for the devastation of Libya, Syria, probably Iraq and other countries in the Middle East, especially Yemen, of course, or the so-called dictators that were toppled? Which would you personally, Professor Fahed Al-Sumait, criticize? The West or the so-called dictators of those countries?
I mean, I think there are many hands involved in the creation of the situations that we have. There are historical trajectories and pathways. I'm hesitant to give any kind of monocausal, this caused this sort of thing. I mean, and also even to describe the West, what do we actually mean by the West? I mean, if we think about the Middle East as a region, it was really France and the UK that divided up through the Sykes-Picot Agreement the various territories that we now think of as different states, and they did so in a way that wasn't very sensitive to the realities on the ground. Do they then represent every Western country? No. And did every Western country have a role in that? No, they didn't. But as things progress, as geopolitics evolve, the powers of the French and the British, have subsided. The United States stepped in to fill that void in this region and played a very major role in, on one hand, trying to promote things like democracy and civil society and journalism and free speech, while on the other hand, also supporting the very political apparatuses that were in place that were preventing that. But, there's a lot of blame to go around, not just in the West, but I mean, how the degree to which, for example, citizens acquiesce if they have an opportunity to not acquiesce, or the ways in which people in local contexts get co-opted into the state apparatus and then end up playing the game that's already there. So there's historical, geopolitical, social, economic, so many different variables that play a role in the trajectory of each individual country. So to me, I don't really see it as one country or one group of countries or one type of like Western apparatus somehow is purely responsible. And I also don't see local populations as purely responsible. I mean, I think it goes around not only between them, but there are other players at large here too. I mean, for example, Russia or China or other big players in the region. And then you can add to this, for example, issues about Israel and security concerns over Israel and the state of Israel, and how it works. You can bring up the question of oil and natural resources and what role does that play, and how are the economics of oil prioritized sometimes over the welfare of people in the countries that produce the oil. So there's many factors as I see it that have led to this situation. Yeah, it's very complex. I mean, to try and boil things down to a single cause is usually not to do justice to the messy nature of reality.
So if that is the case, then the stable dictatorial Middle East would be much better and safer in terms of doing business with the West than, well, unstable, democratized Middle East, for example. Is that fair assessment?
I'm not entirely sure, because they don't just do business with the West. I mean, for example, Kuwait sells more oil to China than it does to the United States. Right, and oil itself is a commodity, so it's not just about who's selling directly to whom. It's also about how the production and the supply and the demand of the global commodity affects the nature of things like security or the cost of oil and transportation costs, etc. But because oil is such a fundamental part of how we use fossil fuels to run everything in life, it's inevitable that it gets caught up in things that are more than just who's buying from whom and who's selling to whom.
Okay, so yeah, of course, this is really important. Nigeria is also an oil producing country. It's part and parcel of OPEC. But briefly, one more thing about democracy in the Middle East. Would you suggest, I mean, do you think that democracy is the type of system that fits the context of the Middle East, for example?
I'm going to throw out another complication for you here, and that is, what do we actually even mean by democracy? I mean, there are many different variations. Democracy as it's practiced in the UK is different than how it's practiced in the United States, which is different than Australia, which is different to many other places. I don't think that there's an inherent impediment to if we think about democracy primarily as giving people the opportunity to be heard and to have elected representatives through free and fair elections, etc. I don't think there's anything inherent to Arab or Muslim culture that prevents it from those things. Those are human ambitions in many ways. But was it Churchill that said, democracy it's the worst form of government except for all the rest. Right? It's far from perfect, right? And we don't even know exactly what we mean. And my dissertation tried to unpack that a bit. And when I looked, for example, amongst different political players here in Kuwait, there were a lot of variations on how they saw the idea of democracy. For some people, Kuwait is a democracy, even though it doesn't have an absolute balance of power. There is an imbalance toward the executive system. Other people saw Kuwait as not a democracy because of that. Some people saw the kind of democracy we have in Kuwait, the parliamentary system, etc., the separation of the judicial system from the executive and the legislative as a real benefit for the country, while other people would look at it and say, well, look at some of the other countries in the region that don't have to deal with parliamentary debates and they can have people that, kind of benevolent rulers that can come in and make decisions unanimously or unilaterally, and they can move fast. And so they'll look at a place like Dubai and they say, well, they don't have the kind of participatory political system that we have in Kuwait, and look how well they're doing. So there were all sorts of different things. And what actually constitutes doing better? Is it fancier buildings, or is it the ability to speak more freely? Is it the quality of the education you can receive? Is it the role of the press? I mean, there's so many elements to it. And so I don't even think we could say there's democracy wouldn't work in say an Arab context. I think what's important, and this is really the key point, is that whatever political systems are derived in any countries in this region or other parts of the world are ones that have indigenous connections. They're ones where people can say, this is not an imported system, and they have a say in how that system looks and how it's designed. And just like many Western countries did, they have to experiment with all the trials and tribulations, successes and failures that come with developing a political system. And that's going to produce better results than, say, for example, what's happened in Iraq, where the United States came in, created a consociational system where they designed the political system according to whether someone is Shia, Sunni, or Kurdish. So it's by religious sect, but it's also by, ethnicity. And then you make that inherently how people define their political allegiances. That's problematic because that was an external imposition of a political system that ultimately has created an identity politics that doesn't function very well. Lebanon has a very similar issue.
Yeah,
so,
of course.
Yeah, so there's nothing that would preclude people from this part of the world being able to have more say in developing a political system, but ultimately it's important that people in any given context are allowed to experiment with political systems and eventually hopefully find something that creates a social balance and produces the kind of welfare for people that is sustained and healthy.
Yeah. So in a simple term, Professor Fahed Al-Sumait is saying that we should allow countries to define democracy based on their own context.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's what's happened in countries that consider themselves solidified democracies now. They all define democracy as they wanted to.
North Korea.
Well, those are not what I would call solidified democracies. But I mean, if you want to talk about the US, the UK, you want to talk about Australia, you want to talk about Germany, France, etc., many countries or many places in Latin America or even parts of Africa, people have been able to experiment with different political systems, and no two democratic systems are the same. There's no cookie cutter, template for this is what democracy has to look like. If there was, then everybody would just have that template and wonderful, we'd all be fine. But it's much messier than that.
Yeah, we're running out of time. We got like 2 or 3 minutes to go before we wrap it up. Here in Nigeria, I think you need to hear this. A lot of people are blaming democracy for the terrible situation that we're experiencing in here. A lot of people are living below poverty line. There is a rise in the price of almost everything because of the subsidy that has been removed by this current administration of Bola Ahmed Tinubu from oil. And life is so miserable here in Nigeria. And so people have begun to say that democracy has failed us in Nigeria. And they were like saying that, we would be better off under a leader like Gaddafi or Saddam Hussein more than the kind of system that we are experiencing currently in. So that maybe is a justification of what you just earlier said about the definition of democracy based on the context, right, of the people that are practicing it.
Exactly. It can be an easy punching bag, but yeah. But ultimately, I think experimenting with something that doesn't work but allows people to express their frustrations with how it doesn't work and to have mechanisms to try and redress things that don't work is probably in the long run going to produce better things than creating a system where you're completely reliant on the whims of someone who's all powerful. Because if they change their opinion or they want to do things that are against the interests of large portions of the population, there's no check and balance for them. So it's better to have, probably, in my opinion, a dysfunctional attempt at democracy than something that appears to be a functional autocracy, but ultimately is not sustainable. Yeah.
Okay. Before we go, I got 2 questions from my uncle. He said, number 1, what is the contribution of political communication as a subdiscipline of political science to state building? Number 2, Kuwait was the most progressive of the Emirates in the Gulf. It has since been surpassed by Qatar and now overtaken by Saudi Arabia. Briefly, what accounts for this? What can you say about this slowdown? So briefly.
Yeah, well, that's hard. Those are two big questions to answer in about a minute. I would say that progressive is like democracy, a term that really needs to be unpacked. There are, in many ways, Kuwait did in the 1950s, 1960s, capitalize on the kind of oil wealth that it had to create a place with a lot of, intellectual, economic, and other types of opportunities that seem to have dissipated a bit. Some people would blame the political system here, the parliamentary system. Other people would blame the powers that work against the parliamentary system. So I think it has to do with the particularities of this country and how it operates, more than it has to do with just like that other countries are surpassing or not surpassing. Okay. But those other countries are doing well in many respects. So I don't mean to also diminish, what they've achieved in places like Qatar or UAE.
Yeah, of course. We have a lot to discuss, but time is not by our side. I hope when next you are less busy, we'll be able to organize probably a panel interview with you and other Middle Eastern affairs analysts to talk about some important issues that have to do with the Middle Eastern region. Professor Fahed Al-Sumait from American University of Kuwait, thank you very much indeed for coming on the show.
Thank you very much for having me. It was a delight talking with you today.
Yeah, what can you say about the show and the interview style?
Yeah, I enjoyed it. Like many professors, I like to talk. So you gave me an opportunity to say my piece. So thank you for that.
Yeah, and I hope my style of questioning was kind of good.
Yes, absolutely. It was a fun discussion. Thank you so much.
Right. You're welcome. It's a pleasure having you on the show. On behalf of everyone that has contributed to the production of the show, my name is Umar Isa Dandago. And once again, many thanks to Professor Fahed Al-Sumait for recording the show for us and for squeezing his time in, despite the difference in time zone, to be on the show. Thank you very much indeed. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Alaikum assalam wa barakatuh.
All right.
Bye-bye.